Fantastic. Well, first of all, hello, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here today. So I'm Dr. Giorgio Caselli. I'm a research fellow at the Center for Business Research of the University of Cambridge. And I'd like to start by thanking, also on behalf of Professor Peter Tyler, who is with me today, Dr. Hanadi Al-Mubaraki, for inviting us to deliver this keynote speech. So our presentation today is based on an ongoing research that Professor Tyler and I have been doing together with Dr. Andy Koch, also from the University of Cambridge, to understand why the Cambridge innovation ecosystem has been so successful. We also recently published an article exploring some of the issues that we will be discussing today, which is available to download on the Hoover platform. After over some 60 years, we think it is now a good time to take stock of the factors that have been associated with the success of the Cambridge phenomenon. Our research is seeking to establish the relative contribution of the people, businesses, and institutions that have come together in Cambridge to create what has become known as the Cambridge phenomenon. And we should be clearer about it in a few seconds. So in the research presentation today, we discuss some of the features of the Cambridge experience that have contributed to its relative success, focusing specifically on how the business base has evolved over time, as well as on the geography of the cluster. So last year marked the 60th anniversary of the Cambridge phenomenon, which is a term many of you may be already familiar with, which was first adopted in a 1980 Financial Times article to describe what was the rapid growth explosion of high technology companies in and around Cambridge. The cluster has now grown to become one of the leading high technology clusters in the world and is home to over 30 science campuses, including the Cambridge Biomedical Campus, which is Europe's largest healthcare and medical research center. It comes with no surprise that the Cambridge phenomenon has been able to attract increasing attention over time, including a number of excellent contributions providing an overview of the phenomenon, such as those by Kate Kirk, Charles Cotton, SQW, and David Gill. However, we think that there has been less evidence to date on how the business base of the cluster has evolved over time, as well as on how the innovation system has developed, particularly as it relates to how the public and private sectors have worked together. So the Cambridge ecosystem has been decades in the making, and indeed did not originate from an ordered or planned process, but instead developed organically out of what we may call creative chaos. In our research, we identify the key elements that have determined the success of the cluster. So a first element is a series of scientific breakthrough that established Cambridge as a leader in information technology and computing. Perhaps the most famous example is the ETSAC, which was the world's first fully functional stored program computer, which was built by Sir Maurice Wilkes and his colleagues at the University of Cambridge's Mathematical Laboratory. Along with this scientific breakthrough, at the heart of the Cambridge phenomenon was also the founding of several technology consultancies, such as Cambridge Consultants, PA Consulting, Sagentia, and the Technology Partnership. A third element was an accommodating land use policy as reflected in the creation of the Cambridge Science Park by Trinity College, one of the 31 colleges part of the University of Cambridge, in 1970, which is credited with kicking off the Cambridge phenomenon. The adoption of a flexible and encouraging IP policy on the part of the University of Cambridge also played an important role. Indeed, there are numerous examples of startups that spun out of the university in order to commercialize an idea that was initially developed as part of academic research. And financial and other support has also been provided to startups via Cambridge Enterprise, which is the commercialization arm of the University of Cambridge. And the availability of finance for companies to grow is itself one of the key elements behind the success of the Cambridge cluster. So among the main investors in the cluster are Cambridge Angels, which is a leading Cambridge-based business angel network of more than 60 high net worth investors, and Amadeus Capital Partners, which is a venture capital firm investing in high technology companies. And the Cambridge innovation ecosystem has also benefited from research and public funding from a variety of organizations, including the Biotechnology and Biological Sciences Research Council. Equally important has been a culture of mutual support and collaboration, which has been nurtured by several membership organizations such as Cambridge Network for the Technology Sector, One Nucleus for Life Sciences and Healthcare, and Cambridge Wireless for Information and Communication Technologies. As shown in this slide, the number of factors making up the Cambridge innovation ecosystem and the complexity of the interactions among them have increased substantially as the ecosystem developed. To make sense of this complex reality, we can say that behind the Cambridge phenomenon are 4 key systems containing the people, businesses, and institutions that have come together in Cambridge to translate knowledge and ideas into outcomes that have enhanced societal well-being and generated commercial success. Our focus today will be on the business system. So how has the Cambridge business base evolved over time? Well, early assessments of the size of the cluster indicated that there were about 300 high-tech businesses in Cambridge in 1985, and we should remember that the starting year or period was 1960, and that set of companies was made up mostly by quite small R&D-driven companies, often academic spin-outs. And there was also a limited number of large companies that tended to dominate employment during the 1980s. So very few companies with a limited number of large companies dominating employment. In turn, over the last 20 years, there was a steady rise in the number of small and medium-sized businesses, with a shift from a focus on R&D to R&D as well as manufacturing. The cluster is now home to over 5,000 KI knowledge-intensive companies, as well as a number of non-corporate knowledge-intensive research organizations, including, for example, the MRC Laboratory of Molecular Biology, the Wellcome Sanger Institute, the Babraham Institute, and the Addenbrooke's Hospital. Contributing to the vibrancy of the cluster is also a number of international tech giants who have opened offices in the Cambridge city. Some of them are Amazon, Microsoft, Apple, and Samsung. The figure that is perhaps most revealing of the vibrancy of the cluster is the 20 unicorns, so $1 billion companies that have been created in Cambridge since the start of the phenomenon. If we examine the size of the Cambridge cluster by decade, we can see that the process, though, has not been linear. The significant growth in employment from the 1980s to the early 2000s was followed by a slowdown during the mid-2000s, which was caused primarily by reductions in high-tech manufacturing. Growth then resumed in the late 2000s, with strong growth during the last decade, driven by fast expanding ICT and life science sectors. And the fast expansion of the ICT and life science sectors in Cambridge meant that their contribution to total corporate employment in the Cambridge cluster has gone up significantly over the last decade, as we can see in this table, with sectors such as software development and publishing, IT and computer services, and biotechnology R&D playing an increasingly dominant role. Behind the growth of the Cambridge cluster is the fact that different technologies in the areas of biotech, infotech, and nanotech have converged over time to give rise to groundbreaking technologies such as biosensors and biochips. Indeed, the Cambridge cluster has witnessed a phenomenal transformation in its sectoral composition, with an increasingly wider spectrum of sectors and technologies, from a specialization in scientific instruments and computing in the early years to a much broader range of technologies, including nanomaterials, drug modeling, and, as we have discussed earlier today, most recently, artificial intelligence and machine learning. So, as part of our research, we've also been mapping the location of Cambridge-based companies operating in the life science and ICT sectors, the largest knowledge-intensive sectors in the Cambridge cluster, with the aim of understanding the geography of the cluster. We are providing here an example for the life science sector in the latest year that we have available, 2019-20, as well as the equivalent version for the ICT sector. And what we find with our analysis is that the geography of the cluster does matter. And it matters because we find that life science and ICT companies tend to be co-located with other similar companies, with agglomeration benefits, including access to a rich pool of talent, availability of specialized investors, and transfer of tacit knowledge. We also find that these companies are concentrated near the center of Cambridge and around some of the main science campuses in the city region, which is one of the main features of the geography of the Cambridge cluster. So science campuses have grown in number and have today become increasingly specialized. Here we are providing some examples of campuses in the Cambridge cluster. So when we talk about life science campuses, we're thinking, for example, about the Baberham Research Campus or the Cambridge Biomedical Campus. There are also campuses with a focus on information and communication technologies, such as the St. John's Innovation Centre. And we also have campuses with a more balanced portfolio of knowledge-intensive companies. And here I'm thinking particularly about the Cambridge Science Park. So a major role for the science campuses has been to provide the neutral space to enable effective interactions within the Cambridge innovation ecosystem. A noticeable feature of some of these campuses is that the investment required to develop them has been secured from extensive public and increasingly charitable funding over a number of years. The Wellcome Genome Campus, the Baberham Research Campus, and the Cambridge Biomedical Campus are but a few examples of campuses that have been developed through a robust partnership between the public and private sectors. The main science campuses in and around the city of Cambridge are summarized in this slide, which shows, as I mentioned earlier, that these campuses have grown considerably over time and do vary in composition as well as specialization. So to conclude, what can we say about the future of the Cambridge cluster? Well, on the bright side, the prospects for future economic growth look encouraging. The Cambridge cluster has many employment concentrations in fast-growing sectors such as life sciences, ICT, high-tech manufacturing, which have performed well through the COVID-19 pandemic. On top of this, AI and fintech companies are growing their presence in the area and are contributing to the vitality of the innovation ecosystem. Last year also saw the demand for laboratory space in Cambridge reaching the highest level for 5 years, despite the disruptions caused by COVID, while UK biotech companies raised a record £2.8 billion in equity finance. However, the success of the Cambridge cluster going forward depends on a lot of moving parts. For example, for people who are a bit familiar with Cambridge, traveling across Cambridge has become increasingly difficult, while buying a house in the city is now a dream for many. And our research suggests that Cambridge-based companies tend to regard transport and housing-related pressures as major constraints to their future growth, framing this issue usually as one of either Cambridge or relocating overseas. So the outbreak of the pandemic itself has also brought a number of additional challenges for the Cambridge economy, which hinges on close-knit interactions among its actors. All these challenges, as well as other challenges, suggest that further research is needed, and we are exploring a fascinating research agenda looking primarily at the evolution of the Cambridge business base, as well as the interactions between the different communities within the innovation ecosystem. We will be delighted to discuss any of these issues with you in greater detail. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you. Anybody have any questions? I have one if no one else does. Are you experiencing something similar to Silicon Valley where a lot of the people are just leaving because they can't afford to live there anymore, and including the companies themselves?
Yes, indeed. I think, Pete, if you want to add something, but it's fascinating actually how close the two experiences are, in the sense that my view is Silicon Valley is about 5 to 10 years ahead of Cambridge. So in a way, we can learn a lot from what is happening in Silicon Valley. And indeed, some of the same issues are happening already here in Cambridge. And today I touched upon just a couple in terms of a shortage of infrastructure, very expensive housing. And so I think for us, it's very important to learn from what is happening in the US indeed, because the challenges are very similar.
It's also worth mentioning, Tom, that the academic community as well in Cambridge, academic salaries are not amongst the highest in the world. So the increasing cost of living is challenging the knowledge base, as well as not just the corporate sector's willingness to locate here, who probably can pay better. So I think this is exactly analogous to, as you say, the American equivalent phenomenon.
Thomas, may I ask a question?
Yes.
Very interesting presentation. I understood from the early days of the Cambridge phenomenon that Cambridge allowed the commercialization of IP without any interference from the university, which is a very, very different position than most universities and certainly most employers today. That's one point. And the second point is actually the Brookings Institute are now talking about trying to get people to places as opposed to places to people, to build the equivalent of these hot tech spots, compared with the other way around by moving people in. I just thought I'd throw that in, and whether it was a true fact, the former of those facts, which I think it is.
Yeah, it's undoubtedly the case that the one of the factors, particularly in the early years, was the university's Cambridge willingness to have a relatively laissez-faire attitude to intellectual property. That's changed somewhat over the years, but I think that itself was very important in the formative part.